Shadow Slave. By Guiltythree. Chapter 12-13, Search and Rescue. Kai looked a bit tired and dehydrated, but other than that, he seemed fine. His transcendent armor had originated from a fire-breathing dragon. After all, out of all them, he was probably capable of dealing with the lethal heat of the nightmare desert best. Looking at his friend, Sunny felt profound relief. He knew, of course, that the government force had been caught between the three gates as well. They had not participated in the battle, and were protected by a saint, so their chances of escaping into the dream realm unscathed had been high. However, knowing and seeing were two different things. Now that Sunny saw Kai, a huge burden had been lifted from his heart. It was a bit bizarre, of course, to be happy about a friend becoming trapped in a death zone with very little hope of ever returning to the waking world. But considering the situation, one had to count their blessings. Sunny exhaled slowly. Kai. You really know how to make an entrance, don't you? Where's Effie? The archer smiled. She's fine. We are with a sizable group of survivors. Many people have entered the desert near each other and naturally bonded together. My Farzite and flight abilities make me the best person to search for survivors, so I've been scouring the desert. It's really fortunate that I stumbled on you first thing in the morning. Nephi's, Seishin, Colonel Jet. It's good to see you all safe and sound. Makes sense. Kai's ability to see things from a ridiculous distance, and even peer straight through solid matter, made him uniquely suited for search and rescue missions. Not to mention that he could traverse great distances swiftly with his extremely fast flight ability. Still, the archer must have fought more than one flying abomination and risked his life on several occasions to make sure that as many humans as possible survived. How very Kai of him. Neph and Jet greeted the handsome young man warmly. Even Seishin, who was usually reserved, spared him a small smile. It was strange for Sunny to see someone interact with representatives of Clan Valor, Clan Song, and the government without making any distinction. But then again, Kai had no part in the conflict between the great clans. More than that, even though Sunny kept forgetting it, the archer was the only member of Neph's cohort who had spent a considerable amount of time living in the Bright Castle under Gunlog's rule. While it was doubtful that Kai and Seishin had interacted a lot, their stations were too different. It was certain that they knew each other much better than the rest of them knew the daughter of Kisong. Kai was also close to several of her handmaidens, so it was not unusual to see her treat him with friendliness. At that moment, Seishin asked the group of survivors. Are there saints among you? Although she tried to keep her voice emotionless, it was obvious that she wanted to know the fate of her sisters. Kai's expression turned a little bleak. He shook his head. Saint Cor was with us. He is the reason the group exists. Without him, most of us would have perished in the sands. He was also the one who found a reliable shelter for us to survive the nights. However, after ensuring our basic safety, he took as many ascended as he could and left for the waking world. East Antarctica must be in the throes of a terrible crisis, and his presence there is paramount. We all understood. Kai sighed. Other than that, we have not seen another saint. Sir Matic and Dire Fong perished on the battlefield. As for the other four, they have to be somewhere near, unless they too chose to return. Seishin's beautiful eyes lost some of their glimmer. She nodded silently and grew quiet. Jet, meanwhile, looked away and grimaced. That's the old man for you. He always has his priorities straight. It was hard to tell whether Wake of Ruin's ruthlessly logical decision to abandon the survivors and return to where he could save the most lives gladdened or disappointed her. The two shared a close relationship, so it was not impossible to imagine that Soul Reaper had hoped to receive St. Cor's help, or at least consideration. Then again, Jet was not a person who relied on others to solve her problems. Perhaps she was simply happy to know that Wake of Ruin survived. Sunny had more pressing questions to ask, though. Have you encountered the creature? N-01 Kai frowned in confusion. The creature? We have encountered many creatures. Which one are you talking about? Sunny and Nephi's exchanged a glance. There's a great abomination hunting the survivors in the desert. It can possess dead bodies, and it is also smart enough to perfectly imitate human behavior. We barely survived encountering it. Kai paled a little. Gods. In that case, I have to inform the others as soon as possible. Sadly, I have not only found survivors. I found a few bodies, as well, some of them not too far from our camp. Luckily, none of them seemed to be moving. We have not faced that horror yet. He frowned, then raised an eyebrow. What? Why are you looking at me like that, Sonny? Sonny lingered for a few long moments and let out a heavy sigh. We're facing. You might not have faced it yet, true. Nephi's added evenly, or you might have faced it already. You just didn't know what you were facing. Kai's expression grew ugly. Sonny looked at the boundless expanse of pristine white dunes. It is really hard to tell that thing apart from real humans. So, how many survivors are in your group? How many of them had been with you from the very start, and how many joined recently? Feeling a cold shiver run down his spine, he hesitated for a few moments, and then asked, how many people did Wake of Ruin take with him back to the waking world? Chapter 12:14, Source of Nightmares. Move, monster. An ascendant of Clan Valor had fear in his eyes as he pushed Mordred in the back with the butt of his spear. Mordred had already been walking as fast as he could, so the forceful push made him stumble and fall. The blistering white sand burned his mangled face. He sighed, then struggled to stand up. One of his eyes was gone, and he had only one hand left. His reflections had all been destroyed. His body was in a sorry state. Even though Mordred had managed to escape the rampage of the Great Being, his luck in the Nightmare Desert was awful. Soon after entering it, he stumbled on the pursuing Gate Guardian, and after barely surviving that unfortunate encounter, a band of surviving masters of Clan Valor ambushed and overpowered him. He had failed to finish off his sister, too. A pity. Now, his arms were bound behind his back with enchanted shackles. Even if he wanted to abandon his original body, he was temporarily trapped within it. The heavy chains were probably not the tool Morgan had planned to imprison him with, but they too were forged by his father. Getting out of the shackles was going to be troublesome. If anything, though, having only one hand left could help with that. Stand up. Mordred sighed in exasperation. I'm trying. Really now, is this how you treat a Prince of Valor? Instead of the answer, the master angrily hit him in the ribs. Mordred plopped back into the scorching sand. Another voice resounded from somewhere above, stop it. You're only slowing us down. The Skinwalker has to be drawing close. If we want to survive, we need to reach the Citadel as soon as possible. Indeed, that was the only reason that the stragglers of Clan Valor had kept him alive. They wanted Mordred to show them the way to the Black Skull Citadel. The Nightmare Desert was vast, but with the Echo Mounts, the band of survivors had been able to traverse a great deal of distance in the past day. Their luck was also not too bad. The area where the call had pulled them was not that far from the Citadel. With Mordred's help, they managed to make it most of the way there. The last stretch, however, had to be traversed on foot. Someone pulled him to his feet. The woman was trying to appear calm, but he could feel her fear. The Ascended had encountered the Skinwalker, too. In fact, the ones with him now were simply those who had survived the encounter. They knew that death, or something much worse, was relentlessly pursuing them. Lead the way. Your life depends on reaching the Black Skull, too. Where is it? Mordred lingered for a moment, then smiled. Don't worry. We're already close. He walked forward, navigating between white dunes and ancient ruins. After several hours of suffocating heat, they finally saw the giant Black Skull appear in the distance. The masters froze for a moment, excitement burning in their eyes. Mordred, however, silently took a step back. He shook his head. These people asked him where the Citadel was, and he led them here. However, they should have asked another question as well. The question was really simple. What had he done with the corpses of the awakened inside the Black Skull Citadel? The answer was that he had done nothing. Nevertheless, human figures suddenly started emerging from inside the giant Black Skull. 1, 2, 3. A dozen, 2 dozens. 3. Time to run. Turning around, Mordred allowed his body to fall and roll down. The Nightstad's headless corpse was also there, walking at the front. The survivors wanted to escape the Skinwalker, but they had actually been marching toward their deaths all along. Time to run. Turning around, Mordred allowed his body to fall and roll down the slope of a tall white dune. In the end, Kai stayed with Sonny and the others. Together, they made their way through the desert, heading for the spot where he had left the other survivors. The path was not easy. There were too many powerful nightmare creatures around, and even though most of them were mesmerized by the call of the seeds, some weren't, or at least not completely. Luckily, none of the abominations they had to fight were of the great rank. Each of the 5 masters was immensely powerful, too. Still, it was a rough journey. All of them were utterly exhausted, suffering from the inhuman conditions of the White Desert, and under terrible mental strain because of the harrowing feeling of being pursued. Nobody knew whether the corpse of Master Su was on their trail or not. But just the possibility of meeting the creature again was enough to fill them with a suffocating sense of dread. The abominations they fought were all powerful and dreadful, too. Out of the 5 of them, Nephi seemed to be affected the least. However, she was struggling with her own burden. Looking at the flawlessly white expanse of white dunes, she shook her head and sighed quietly. I never thought I would return here one day. Or, at least, so soon. For them, this land was called the Nightmare Desert simply because it was the source of the chain of nightmares. But for her, it was the source of her personal nightmares. She had never spoken about her time here in detail, but Sunny knew that it must have been a gruesome experience. Gruesome enough that the proud and strong Changing Star had agreed to receive psychological counseling, even. This desert, and whatever she had experienced in the second nightmare, were not things one could easily forget. I can imagine. No, actually, I don't think I can. Sunny had only spent a day in the Nightmare Desert, and that was as a master, in the company of other people. Yet the sight of endless white dunes was already making him feel a hint of despair. What would it have been like, to get lost in this cursed land alone, as a powerless sleeper? We're getting close. Kai's voice distracted him from the heavy thoughts. In front of them, the sand receded a little, and 5 strangely shaped metal towers could be seen protruding from it, arranged in a semicircle. The sunlight was reflecting on the polished metal, making it even more blinding. Each tower had a different height, with the shortest of them being at least several dozen meters tall. Sunny stared at them for a few moments before realizing what the towers were. They were the tips of 5 fingers belonging to a colossal steel gauntlet. The gauntlet itself was buried under sand. He did not know what creature could have worn the gauntlet, and where the rest of it was. And, right now, Sunny did not care. All he cared about was that the towers were hollow, and there was shade inside. There are also people inside. Sunny's expression turned grim as he followed Kai toward the temporary camp of the survivors. It'll be good if there are only people. Chapter 12:15, Steel Tower. There were lookouts hiding in the shadows of the 5 towers. Of course, Sunny had no trouble noticing them. All of them were masters, and in a very rough shape. Just like Sunny, they had gone from participating in a bloody battle to entering the Nightmare Desert and being forced to fight for their lives without a real opportunity to rest. Masters of the Great Clan Valor, Great Clan Song, and the government were working together without a second thought. Even though some of the wounds they bore had been delivered by the other humans in the group, no one thought about continuing the feud. All conflict had been forgotten in the face of the ruthless desert. How sweet. Indeed, the spell had a way of bringing people together. It also had a way of bringing nightmare creatures and people together. As soon as their party of 5 entered one of the steel fingers through a narrow crack, Sunny's expression darkened. There were about 20 humans sheltered in the cool darkness of the hollow tower. Some looked like they had just returned from exploring the dunes, while others were busy with various tasks, preparing food, refining the carcasses of dead abominations into valuable materials, drawing maps of the surrounding area. Even though Wake of Ruin had abandoned the group, the Ascended did not seem willing to give up on their survival. Perhaps it was because of a certain person who had taken charge and driven them forward. So she survived, too. Morgan had lost her intricate plate armor, and wore a black tunic. The scarlet cloak was wrapped around her shoulders, falling to the ground like a waterfall of blood. The Princess of War seemed tired and reserved. There were no wounds on her body, but the usual sharpness of her vermilion eyes was strangely dulled. She was standing in the center of the hollow tower, listening to the reports of the scouts. As the 5 of them entered, Morgan looked up from a crude leather map and glanced in their direction with a distant expression. Then, her eyes shimmered. "My sister is alive." Her voice was hoarse and emotionless. The scouts were confused for a moment, then turned around. Their faces grew excited. Lady Changing Star. It's. However, the words were drowned out by a happy shout, doofus. Princess. A tall and robust figure that seemed to have been cast of lustrous steel walked over to them with ginger steps and subjected Sunny to an earth-shaking shoulder pat. You guys made it. With that, Effie grinned, and suddenly grabbed startled Nephi's into a tight hug. Wah. Effie, I can't breathe. The huntress let go of Neph and looked at the two of them with sparks dancing in her eyes. Thank the gods. You are masters, after all. I was afraid that the two of you pale apparitions would be all red and burned by the time you got here. Usually, Sunny would have reacted in a more friendly manner, but right now, he did not pay Effie a lot of attention. Instead, he was carefully studying the other ascended gathered in the finger of the titanic gauntlet. His expression was neutral. His mind, however. Damnation. Under Sunny's relaxed gaze, the souls of the ascended shone with bright radiance. However, not all of them. Some were hiding a boundless expanse of vile, virulent darkness. They were infected by the cancerous growth of corruption. Out of the 20 masters here, 7 were no masters at all. They were all vessels of the same creature that had worn the skin of Ascended Sue as a disguise. We are all going to die, aren't we? Sunny lingered for a few moments, then looked at Effie. We are all right, but what about you? To be honest, I'm a little surprised. That you haven't eaten all these people yet. I mean, I know your appetites. And is it just me, or have you gained weight? Time. He had to stall for time. Effie blinked a couple of times and smiled softly. Which would have made Sunny shiver in any other situation. Keep talking. I'll eat you first. Accompanied by her, they walked toward Morgan. As they did, the atmosphere in the hollow tower suddenly grew a little colder. Song Saishan. Morgan's voice was even. Saishan met her piercing gaze with the grace of a person who had survived a decade of hell on the forgotten shore. Her reply was similarly composed, Morgan. The two stared at each other with frightening intensity. Kai coughed and shifted from one leg to another. Sunny hesitated, then sent him a mental message, why didn't you tell us that Morgan was here? The archer looked at him and shrugged helplessly. Groaned. She must have arrived after I left to search for more survivors. She wasn't here in the morning. There won't be trouble, right? The two of them will see reason. Surely. A gust of wind crashed into the hollow tower, and the ancient metal groaned. Morgan shook her head. We'll put our quarrel aside, for the time being. Let's return to the waking world before doing anything rash. Saishan slowly nodded. Agreed. She didn't seem to be flustered at the prospect of facing the Princess of War in combat. Sunny wasn't entirely sure how powerful Saishan was, currently, after all, she had ascended later than most of them. On the other hand, she was older and had accumulated much more experience in the Dark City. It didn't matter, though. Last night, the cumulative power of Saishan, Sunny, Jet, and Saint had been barely enough to slow down just one vessel of the Gate Guardian for a few moments. And now, they were surrounded by 7 of them. Morgan seemed to have no idea of how doomed they all were. Which was not surprising. In fact, it was Sunny and Jet who were freaks capable of peering through the disguise of a great abomination. Both of their aspects were one of a kind and exceedingly rare. It would be quite improbable to assume that anyone else in the Nightmare Desert possessed similar capabilities. Maybe Cassie did. But she was not here. Sunny felt his chest grow tight as he thought about the blind girl. Where was she now? Had she managed to escape the slaughter? Morgan, meanwhile, looked at Nephi's. I must congratulate you, sister. Oh, and Master Sunless, of course. Killing Dire Fong. It was a pleasant surprise. I should think about how to reward you. She turned to Sunny, remained silent for a moment, and then suddenly smiled. I do hope you won't ask to fight me again, though, Master Sunless. The environment here is not quite as dreamlike as the last time I had to reward you. As Nephi's, Saishan, Effie, and Jet gave Sunny strange looks, he cleared his throat and forced out a smile. No, no. I wouldn't dare to request something untoward. Again. At the same time, he used the blessing of dust to speak with Morgan silently, smiling pleasantly. He said, do as I say if you don't want to die.